Okay, so this is part two of whoever many knows how many parts we're going to do. I don't know. So we're talking Romans 13, 1 through 7. And I'm going to just do this in sort of a reflective way. Used a bunch of different resources, and we'll probably use a ton more resources. But my motivation, again, for doing this is that we could have, I think, some clear understanding on the text. And again, there will be moments where I think that there'll be some really literal, clear aspects of the text, and then there's just going to be some offshoots and rabbit trails, and I hope we're all okay with that. But Romans 13, 1 through 7 is, I'm going to read it for you, maybe with you, depending on if you have a Bible with you or not. The two translations that I'm going to use just in this reading, so I'm going to use a New Revised Standard Version, and then I'm also going to use the Common English Bible. But I will say that I studied in addition with the New American Standard Bible. And the reason why I did a couple of different Bibles is because each sort of translation deals with the text in different ways. And that's because of how they chose to translate some of the original manuscripts that they were looking at. So copies of the copies when I say original manuscripts. And so just kind of throughout history, obviously we know that as we're reading it in English, it wasn't originally written in English. And so there's some, sometimes people will say translation liberties, that they're just kind of maybe injecting certain things on the text. But for the most part, I think like the New Revised Standard Version and the American Standard Bible are two texts that are very faithful to the original language. But I also like the Common English Bible because it's really helpful to just hear it in a way that makes sense to my ears, which is helpful when I need it to make sense in my mind and in my heart. So the first one I'm going to read is Romans 13, 1 through 7 from the New Revised Standard Version. So let me do that for you. It says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. There is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you wish to have no fear of the authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive its approval, for it is God's servant for your good. But if you do what is wrong, you should be afraid, for the authority does not bear the sword in vain. It is the servant of God to execute wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also because of conscience. For the same reason, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants, busy with this very thing. Pay to all what is due them. Taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, honor to whom honor is due." And that's the end of verse 7. So then I'm going to also, like I said, read the Common English Bible just so you can hear it in a different way. Romans 13, 1 through 7 from a Common English Bible. "Every person should place themselves under the authority of the government. There isn't any authority unless it comes from God, and the authorities that are there have been put in place by God. So anyone who opposes the authority is standing against what God has established. People who take this kind of stand will get punished. The authorities don't frighten people who are doing the right thing. Rather, they frighten people who are doing wrong. Would you rather not be afraid of authority? Do what's right, and you will receive its approval. It is God's servant given for your benefit. But if you do what's wrong, be afraid because it doesn't have weapons to enforce the law for nothing. It is God's servant put in place to carry out his punishment on those who do what is wrong. That is why it is necessary to place yourself under the government's authority, not only to avoid God's punishment, but also for the sake of your conscience. You should also pay taxes for the same reason, because the authorities are God's assistants concerned with this very thing. So, pay everyone what you owe them. Pay the taxes you owe, pay the duties you are charged, give respect to those you should respect, and honor those you should honor." That's verses 1 through 7, Romans 13. I feel like I should say, "This is the word of the Lord." And then you would say, "Thanks be to God." Anyway, So in reading all that scripture, I think a couple points. Number one, when you hear, whether it's through the two versions I read it in, or if you're reading the NIV or whatever you may be using as a scripture that you're reading, that version, excuse me. I do not want us to fall into the trap of thinking, oh, it's super clear cut, because I can commit to you that it's not nearly as clear cut as you think it is. And it's not nearly as free as you think it is. It's somewhere in between, and I will confess to you that's my perspective and my opinion. I think that there's others that are very like, well, this is what it says and this is what it means, and I don't want to dissuade us from. I think there's really some things in Scripture that are very abundantly clear, and we can just take the literal meaning of the text and really understand it. But I think there's other instances, and Romans 13 is one of those instances. Well, while we can read the literal words that were inspired by the Spirit of God for the author, I do think that it was set within a specific context. Now, that doesn't mean that the context dictates what the text is going to say, but it does influence how it's applied, right? And what the author is even going to say in the first place. Because prior to us ever receiving this, where there were original author and original recipients, and I think that they at least need to be considered and acknowledged. And sometimes that can look like conjecture, and so when I feel like there's moments for that, I'll say that. But I think that there's other times where it's just really sort of clear that the author of whatever the biblical text is writing to a specific situation for a specific time, and we need to take that into account as we're reading and understanding. So in saying that, I think that it's really important for us to just go maybe through the first part, and understanding that when this is written, this is during the reign of Nero, and this is pre-Nero burning Christians and lighting them on fire and feeding them to lions and all the travesties that the early church experienced under the reign and rule of Nero. Let alone, by the way, that it would actually be a few short years from when this is written to when that would happen. But then also just to be mindful of the Christians standing within reason that the recipients of this letter are then going to have to hold this context and this context for the future as well. So in the burning of Rome, which was eventually blamed on Christians, regardless of who started it, always conjecture around that. But they would be in some ways holding this text as they're dealing with the things that they're going to be dealing with in the future. So I think it's helpful to understand that the Christians that were the early recipients of this text were not under the persecution that they would find themselves in the coming years, which was a stark contrast. Just night and day difference. That doesn't mean that they were not experiencing difficulties, but for the most part, at least based off of the commentaries that I was reading, and I forgot to bring them downstairs, so in the next video, I'll be sure to include some of the sources that I've been using, well, all the sources that I've been using. But it's just to say, for the sake of treating it like it's live, all of the sources that I read on it really presented the early church for the wider sort of people in Rome or amongst the Roman Empire, that Christians were still kind of viewed, at least from a Roman perspective, as a Jewish sect. So even though they had a sense of identity and they were followers of the way, how that was ultimately interpreted in the larger society is that they were just a Jewish sect. I mean, Christ was in some ways interpreted. I mean, he was a Jew, but he was also interpreted as a Jew. And there's various perspectives on even how Roman culture and society, or the first century Jewish people, would have perceived him in the sense of his role and responsibility in relationship to the wider culture at large. But at least what we can see is that for the most part, when this is written and when it's received, it's to a people that are nominal in size and dimension compared to the wider Roman reign and rule. And that, for the most part, I would say the majority of the Jesus followers at that time were Jewish. And so while they were not a sect of a Jewish faith, although we know the roots of that, many of them were coming from cultural lifestyle that was Jewish. And so while they would have said that they were the followers of the way, at least from what I understand in reading the history, is that I think that they were probably still very Jewish in the way that they lived their daily lives, because it stands within reason that it would be familiar. And I certainly think that the gospel interacts heavily. I mean, you see Jesus' teaching interacts heavily with the Old Testament. So it makes sense in that way that Romans would have interpreted the followers of the way of Jesus to even be Jewish, because it may look like from the outside in that they were just very Jewish in the way that they lived their lives, or however a Roman citizen or a slave or whomever was viewing them. It could have come off as very Jewish. So, in saying that, why that's important is because we need to understand that for the most part, that at least from what I can understand from the history, is that the Jewish people living in the Roman Empire, for the most part, there's always exceptions to the rules. There are always people that were pushing against the status quo of the empire. But for the most part, Jews were considered to be non-violent, non-resistant, and the only time, for the most part, again, there's the Maccabees. So we know that there was certainly uprisings and revolts that needed to be quelled by the Roman Empire, or the Roman Empire wanted to quell them. But for the most part, the Jewish people were living in such a way that would be non-resistant and non-violent, as long as it wasn't in contrary to the law. So in terms of God's law, because that was how what life was oriented around. It was the laws of God. We say the law, but I think the Ten Commandments is something that we're often familiar with. But it was, they have all these scriptural texts that we call the Old Testament that really, some people would say dictate. I would say really helped a follower of Yahweh understand what it meant to live a life of worship. And because of their deep appreciation of God, that was a gift, is to say, well, this is what a gift that you, God, the God of the universe, would show me how I can worship you, how I can honor you, how I can bring you praise in my daily lives. And so as long as the Roman Empire wasn't in direct sort of contrast to the law, then they were pretty much like, yeah, just you do you. Because at the end of the day, in many ways, they're also a minority amongst the wider empire, for sure. Maybe not so much in specific cities and towns, but one single or a couple representatives of the Roman Empire in a city was the same thing as Rome itself. And so we have to acknowledge that. So I think there's probably other reasons why, but for most part, the followers of the way would have probably, at least in thought or experience, would have been very consistent in the idea of non-resistance and non-violence. Certainly there were Gentiles that were a part of that, and certainly there were Jews that were a part of that, both of which were about like, oh, no, I don't need to do this. I'm a part of a new kingdom. And I think we can get into that in future parts of this text. But I think it's helpful when we're reading Romans to then understand who are the people that would largely be receiving this portion of the letter, and how that then contextualize how they're going to interpret the words that are being read to them probably out loud. So we're at the 15-minute mark, so I'm going to stop this one. Maybe I'll do another one because I didn't really cover a lot except for maybe parts of the history. So let me do that, and I'll do a third one. Okay.